In this week's latest release of Jujutsu Kaisen, we found out that we might very well be approaching the end of Shinjuku Showdown. But as we get towards the end of it, there are more questions popping up and quite a few interesting events that have happened so far, so let's go ahead and get into it. But before we begin, please be sure to like and subscribe to the channel so I can always deliver you more anime content. Alright, let's get to it. So the first thing that we have to keep in mind is that this week was more movement in the comic, but we haven't quite hit another significant period in the fight yet between Sukuna and Gojo. We've certainly had some interesting developments, and I think we've had a setup for an interesting development, but we're still kind of waiting for what I assume will actually be the end of this fight. Now, we've pretty much seen now that Gojo is soloing Agito and Maharaga along with Sukuna now. And over the course of this battle, we get to see, Gojo adapt to that. We've kind of seen Gojo now really ponder the idea of what it's like to fight somebody who's basically on his level. And while that is interesting, it hasn't really moved along, given that this officially marked the 10th chapter into this fight. So it's kind of interesting now that we're finally seeing some of that development on that front. But let's go ahead and break it down individually so we can kind of go over what happened. Starting with the first and most interesting aspect of all of this, they finally wanted to leave the viewing station. I can't believe how happy I am to finally see the characters that I like and respect finally wanting to get off the couch. That probably sounds kind of weird because I know how many people were waiting for a big fight between Sukuna and Gojo and how much people didn't want anyone else in it. But at this point, watching everybody else sit around and wait for the conclusion of this is frankly a little boring and frustrating. And I'm going to get onto why that towards the end of this, but it's kind of funny to me that while Gojo is clearly the only person that could fight Sukuna in his regular form, let alone somebody that could fight Sukuna along with the Ten Shadows technique, the fact everybody else feels that it's okay to just sit down and observe this has been an incredibly frustrating part, and the fact that that's now being reflected by characters getting a little antsy is at least appreciated. We also got to find out a little bit more about Agito, even though it kind of ended up disappearing at the end of this chapter. But we did find out that it is essentially I think it's actually an extension technique. They call it a totality, but totality is what happens when you mix a destroyed Shikigami's power with a still active one. While that does apply for this because Orochi is in this and it was destroyed, we find out that 2/3 of this are Round Deer and another Shikigami that basically make it what it is. That sounds more like Bottomless Well than it does in actual totality like Demon Dog totality, but I digress. We also found out that apparently the free composing parts of this were Orochi, Round Ear, and something called Tiger's Funeral. I don't know what that is. We've never seen Tiger's Funeral. Apparently it was a mixture inside of this, but we've never seen it. We don't know what its capabilities are and what it does. I'm a little disappointed by that. The last of the 10 Shikigami has apparently just been revealed to us, but we have no idea what it looks like or what its special ability was. So I'm hoping we'll get to see it, because like I said, this does seem more like Bottomless Well than anything else, so I'm assuming that its destruction does not constitute a complete loss of the Shikigami. Like when you destroy the little toads for Bottomless Well, but we don't know that for sure. I'm just assuming. We also got to see that Sukuna apparently fears purple. Okay, I say see. Really, Gojo speculated on this because of how much he's been trying to dodge and avoid it throughout this whole fight. And I mean, that makes sense somewhat. We know that Hollow Purple is one of his strongest techniques, if not the strongest, outside of his domain expansion technique. I mean, it had the ability to kill Toji, and we've seen it rip apart whole areas. And to be honest, had Hanami not been that quick, it might have very well destroyed Hanami as well. So it's like no joke, and it's not really a surprise that Riemann Sukuna wants to avoid it as much as possible. That having been said, it's kind of funny to me that that was actually his opening move, and it's kind of been the thing now that he's been avoiding using, because Sukuna's been avoiding it. There hasn't really seemed to have been any attempts on Sukuna's part to avoid it. It just kind of seems to come more from Gojo's instinct around it. I guess that's fine. I mean, Gojo is incredibly powerful, and we do know that essentially because Hollow Purple uses imaginary mass, it's basically unblockable. However, I get the feeling that there might be some problems with this in the next chapter, depending on which way the story goes. but we'll talk about that too in a little bit. I just think that it's going to be really interesting because we also know that this won't specifically be hollow purple, provided the translation was correct. Apparently, it's going to be something called unlimited purple. I don't know if that's like a bigger version of it, but that's going to be cool. So obviously, with the setup for Ultimate Purple, Unlimited Purple, or just Hollow Purple, if the translation wasn't right, being set up, I think we're pretty fair to say that we're going to get to see Gojo do something really cool in this version. We've already seen him do a lot here that looked fantastic, but hasn't actually made all that much of a difference given that this fight has been 10 chapters without any relative change between the two characters. So I think what we're looking forward to here is this will probably be the last chapter of the fight next week. I could see it dragged out into two more, but this will probably be the last one. However, I think that while Hollow Purple will or will not be effective, it will be the end of the fight, but the conclusion of the fight will come in the chapter after. The reason I say this is because I think Sukuna and Gojo are going to continue to fight until Gojo finally pins him into a position where he at least thinks he can use Hollow Purple. Now, the important thing to keep in mind with this too is that regardless of whether Hollow Purple or not works, there are factors outside of this individual fight, and I think that we need to take this into account as we finally approach the end of this. So, for what it's worth, I don't think Gojo is actually going to beat Sukuna with this. It's just too neatly wrapped up, and I think that a lot of other people have already pointed to this because they say that, like, well, the whole reason that Sukuna has the Ten Shadows technique is that he can beat Gojo with it. I don't actually think Gojo is necessarily going to lose here because while I definitely think that was the idea, I also think that Gege is smart enough to take into account that when he wrote that, Mahoraga beat a user of the Six Eyes and the Limitless technique, he did also specifically state that that person died that did the summoning. Technically, you can think of this as, well, obviously Mahoraga would have killed it, but the other way to look at that is that person was probably already dying from fighting a Limitless user, so it kind of makes sense that they probably did this as their trump card, like Megami did. And because of that, I think that you have to look at this and say, okay, there's a very good chance here that if Gojo can wrap this up quick, at least severely weaken Sukuna, it might disrupt his ability to summon Mahoraga. And that is fair. We do know that if you can disrupt the sorcerer enough, the Ten Shadows technique will be released. We've seen it happen with Megami a couple different times. And because it's not instated via the pact of the exorcism, it won't last until the user dies. If he loses consciousness or loses concentration, Mahoraga will disappear. That having been said, while I do think that's a possibility, Kenjaku is going to one-shot at least one of them. I don't know which one he's going to do first. My over-under is that I think he's going to one-shot Sukuna after Gojo does this. And I know that a lot of people are thinking, like I think Gojo is doing this to essentially make Sukuna have to strike a new deal with Megami and essentially have to form a pact so that they can swap back and forth basically what Yuji and Sukuna used to be. The downside of that is it doesn't matter. We already know from the beginning of the Culling games that as soon as you have one of the reincarnated sorcerers within you, you, for better or worse, count as that reincarnated sorcerer. That's why Yuji had one of the Kogane appear before him as Culling Games was beginning. So it doesn't have to actually be Sukuna being out for this to apply. And it more than likely won't be. Whether it's Megami or not, we will probably see, Kenjaku kill him, and that would be unfortunate, but that will probably happen. I don't know if this would necessarily be a permanent death. After all, he does have round ear, so depending on the circumstance, it could be, like what happens with Yuji and a couple of other characters earlier on where they do the fake death thing, which has actually happened a couple times in the series. I wouldn't mind that because I would like Megami back, but we have to acknowledge that there is a possibility that at least one person here is going to die permanently. You also can't sidestep the fact that it would be good for every bad guy that's remaining to essentially get rid of Gojo. And I mean, Gojo's going to be at his weakest at the end of this fight no matter what happens. I also hold the personal opinion that I think Hollow Purple might have a condition attached to it that lowers his defense. We know that he can use red and blue simultaneously, and because the infinite is essentially a version of blue, he doesn't lose defense for using it. But I think that using Hollow Purple is going to leave him vulnerable because it just feels like there's conditions attached to it. We've never actually seen him use it when he was like in a vulnerable position. Even when he uses it against Toji, Toji was far enough away that he judged that he could use that without the real threat, and I think that that makes a big difference to him. So, whatever happens, I think that we're also going to kind of see a comeuppance here where the other sorcerers are talking about the fact that they are going to have to go after Kenjaku and well, what little remains for the bad guys at this point. And ironically, I could see him attacking them first as another possible option because they are all foolishly gathered in the same place. Of course, he doesn't even have to attack them, he could just raise a barrier around them. But no matter what happens, I think that we're not looking at a simple Sukuna or Gojo will win this week. I think we're looking at there's going to be a great upset and another big transition for the series. But why don't you guys let me know what you think is going to come next week and who you think is actually going to win the fight?